Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Mona Forrest, and I am a patient advocate and operations manager at the Canadian Cancer Survivor Network, and I'll be moderating this session. Today's webinar is the United States Coming for Canadian Medicine, focuses on the potential risks to Canadian medicine access due to current plans in some U.S. states to mass import prescriptions from Canada's national supply. We're pleased to welcome today's presenter, John Adams, Board Chair of Best Medicines Coalition, and John is also the co-founder and president and CEO of the Canadian PKU and Allied Disorders group. John will use his expertise on the Canadian prescription landscape to provide an overview of this danger. Following the presentation, we'll have a question and answer session. During the webinar, you can type your questions into the window on your right on your screen, and the questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. On behalf of the Canadian Cancer Survivor Network, I would like to thank you for attending today's webinar. For almost 9 years, we've been working to help cancer patients and survivors learn about health system complexities, connect with others to plan action, and act to promote best care and healthier survivorship. If you'd like to learn more about CCSN, please visit www.survivornet.ca. Today's webinar will be recorded and will be available in full tomorrow on the CCSN YouTube and SlideShare accounts. Links to both will be sent to registrants using their registered email. To keep informed about upcoming webinars, again, sign up for our newsletter at www.survivornet.ca. With that, I pass things over to you, John, to begin your presentation.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Mona, for that. And I just want to start by giving a shout out to Jackie Manthorn, who came up with the idea, and Jackie is the president of the Canadian Cancer Survivor Network. And I'd say that, Jackie, even if I wasn't a cancer survivor, and even if your network wasn't a member of the Best Medicines Coalition, it's from my heart. The question is the United States coming for Canadian medicines? And my thesis is that the answer is yes. The open question is how soon? Let me explain. So there was a political earthquake affecting Canadians that took place on July the 31st of this year, when the President of the United States announced a safe importation action plan. And you will note he also specifically calls out Governor Ron DeSantis, who's the new governor of Florida, a Republican. In the second tweet, Secretary Alex Azar is the Secretary of Health and Human Services, and for the earthquake is that for the first time in 20 years, a Secretary of Health and Human Services has said, we can make this work. Stand by for some details as we walk through this. And there's wide political support for this in the United States. When Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump are on the same page, we should pay attention. The problem is Americans, citizens, and American politicians have been in love with the idea of cheaper medicines from Canada for more than 20 years. The next is, and when the news first broke, this is a comment, an observation from an objective observer, professor at the University of Ottawa. And what does it mean when the parasite is 10 times bigger than the host? It could lead to the greatest drug shortage we've ever seen. And the good professor of law urged our federal government to protect Canadians by bringing in its own legislation that would restrict medicine exports intended for Canadians from being exported to other countries. Stand by, we'll into that. Other reactions to the announcement: Canadians respond, Canadians worried, fear and loathing in Canadian pharmacies. Trump's crazy drug import plan turns backlash in Canada. Trump and Saunders want to ease imports of drugs from Canada. Canada says not so fast. And then, unfortunately, a rather weak-kneed response from the then current federal government that Canada wasn't consulted on the specifics. Well, it's not the specifics are the problem. It's the actual entire thrust of the change. So a little bit about an agenda today and the introductions about what the Best Medicines Coalition is, the background on ongoing drug shortages in Canada, background on the U.S. landscape, prices, policy, and politics, why bulk importation to America should be a concern for all Canadians, and the responses to date of Canadian stakeholders and our government, and then what's next, and then an opportunity for Q&A. And these are the logos of all the 28 organizations that belong to the Best Medicines Coalition, large and small. There are 26 national groups and 2 regional groups. And as I said, it includes one of our newest members is the Canadian Cancer Survivor Network. We're pretty diverse, and we reflect the diversity of Canada. What we're all about is safe and timely access to medications that have shown on the best evidence available to make things better for patients. We want to make sure that our drug programs, public or private, deliver high standards of safe, timely, equitable, and consistent access. That the systems for reviewing drugs and surveilling them after they have market approval keep patient safety and knowledge of the risks and benefits throughout the life of the drug. And we also advocate for meaningful, equitable patient participation in those drug reviews and policy development. The other thing, before I get on, one of our issues is drug shortages, but let me briefly highlight, we are also paying a lot of attention to the development of national pharmacare and the design of the proposed new Canadian Drug Agency and whether or not patients will be on the governing board as recommended by the Hoskins report. We're also paying attention to price controls, initiatives, and the impact on access for Canadian patients to new breakthrough medicines. But on the drug shortages issue, we're deeply involved. There are people on this call who know more about it than I. BMC as a representative, Dennis Morris on the Health Canada Stakeholder Committee on Drug Shortages. And when we had a meeting with the Minister of Health, I was shocked when the president of the Canadian Pharmacists reported that pharmacists are spending 20% of their time every day trying to do workarounds for drugs that they can't get, and their distributors say they're just not available. And it's affecting, the president of the Canadian Medical Association chimed in and said, virtually every pharmacist and every doctor is dealing with this for part of every day. And that's the situation as it is, particularly for epilepsy, hypertension, cancers, and Parkinson's. The background in the United States, the first issue here is drug prices. Their second issue in the United States is, and our issue in terms of national pharmacare, is people without insurance, either government or private. But you can see the evidence here that the highest drug prices in the world are in the United States. And let's just compare it to US and Canada. This is the per capita spend based upon data from actually now 5 years ago. My understanding is that spread has gotten worse. So that is why Americans and American politicians are looking for some responses, real or pretend. Okay, and many of us will be aware of insulin caravans coming to Canada. Senator Bernie Sanders led one of them not too long ago, about the time that the earthquake took place, the policy earthquake took place. This is a high-profile example. One important distinction, though, is that in Canada, no one needs a doctor's prescription to buy insulin at a pharmacy in Canada. That's not true in the United States, and that's not true for almost every other drug. And that presents an ethical dilemma for our pharmacists who are in border locations, because we're also experiencing, from time to time, insulin shortages in border communities. We like it when the Americans let us know they're coming, and they do usually, but not always. Okay, what's a solution? One is the bulk import at the wholesale level. of medicines that were in Canada intended for Canadians. So, as we speak, officials in the White House in Washington, D.C. are vetting a draft plan from the two key parts of the U.S. government, the Department of Health and Human Services and its subsidiary, the Food and Drug Administration, that would allow for bulk importation of medicines intended for Canadians. And there are two tracks here. They're also looking at a draft of how to do this from other countries. Why this is picking up momentum and has been for some time. 4 states have passed local laws which would empower the state, their wholesalers or their pharmacies to import in bulk, and they're working on details. At least 20 other states are considering such laws, and many more are expected. It's reasonable. The U.S. Drug industry base is not in favor of this, and they've been public about that, to say the least. And when a plan is put in place legally, we can expect that they'll be going to court. And how long that might drag out is anyone's best guess. Now, what's really different is that, as I said at the front, besides the fact that Mr. Trump is running for re-election, he's using this as part of his election platform. But the really important thing is, for 20 years, in Democratic and Republican administrations, the secretaries of health have said, I cannot certify that the drugs coming from Canada are safe. And that has been the position because while they have safety measures in the United States, their oversight of the supply chain does not extend across the border to Canada. Congress passed the enabling legislation 20 years ago. And now we have a Secretary of Health who says, I'm going to make this work. That was not his choice. It was a career-ending decision if he was going to continue to have reservations about it. It's obvious that ask the Kurds or ask the folks in the Ukraine where they stand in terms of political needs in the United States versus their interests. Same would be true for Canadians. U.S. patients have been after this for 20 years because it's a simple, if not simplistic solution, access to cheaper medicines without having to face the heavy lifting of the complex and broken healthcare system in the United States. U.S. politicians are also in favor of this because it's a simplistic solution. And it means if they do something or appear to be doing something, that they won't have to reform the U.S. healthcare system, which is broken. They won't face the anger of health insurance companies, pharmacy benefit managers, the middlemen, or even the drug manufacturers by changing financial stakes in what's going on. Okay, next slide. So what's really happened is that there's a political partnership between the governor of Florida, the new governor, and the current president, and more about that in the next here. Mr. DeSantis was a Republican member of the Congress. He decided to run for governor of Florida on the Republican ticket. He got the nomination. He got elected last November, sworn in January. Mr. DeSantis had supported Mr. Trump for the presidential nomination in 2016. Excuse me. And Mr. Trump returned the favor when Mr. DeSantis was running for governor and running for the Republican nomination. And Mr. DeSantis, as governor, is now returning the favor in politics by helping to raise money to protect Mr. Trump from the impeachment process. Bear in mind, Governor DeSantis took office in January, and within 2 months, they had passed this law on importing drugs. And its effective date was actually noticed was July the 1st. But they needed permission from the U.S. Federal Health Department to make this real. And Florida's not alone. Colorado has passed a law, and just in the last week sent out a request for information for organizations and persons interested in doing this with a very short turnaround. This is moving fairly quickly at the state level. And here, every candidate for president in both parties is in favor of this idea. So it's safe to say that the next president of the United States is going to be in favor of it, no matter who wins the election in November 2020. And the politicians aren't just there in the states and the legislatures. It's also NGOs, such as a very powerful group, the American Association for Retired Persons. They're actually making representations at the state legislatures to pass the enabling legislation. They're really on board with that. Now, let me talk about the backflip by Secretary Azar. This is what he said before May of this year. They're really small, Canada. And he, by the way, he used to be president of Pfizer in the United States. Pfizer's not a small drug company. Canada simply doesn't have enough drugs to sell them to us for less money. And drug companies won't sell Canada or Europe more just to have them imported here. That was his decision before he had a conversation with the boss.
John, can I ask a question? It's sort of not clear. So Canada does not manufacture the majority of drugs that we use here in Canada. We import them. Well, my question is that why does the U.S. not import them from where Canada imports them?
They can, theoretically, if the drug companies will sell them to them. They're doing it now. But the U.S. government doesn't do it on a centralized basis. It's a very decentralized open market between private transactions and some government health programs that do the transactions. They have that option if they can work out the business arrangements. But the problem in the United States isn't the supply. The problem, as perceived by politicians and patients, is the price. So it's not necessarily an automatic and direct solution to just increase the supply into the United States. What they're trying to do is substitute the cheaper prices of drugs intended for Canadians for the more expensive drugs produced for Americans, no matter where they're produced. And there are two tracks going on. One track is specifically for Canada at the Federal Health Department, and the second track is for other countries around the world. All right, but the focus of my conversation today is on the first track, which is the one specifically designed for Canada. Hope that's helpful. And this is the plan, the Safe Importation Action Plan. And this is an announced plan. Their regulation making process in the United States, they call it rulemaking. And so we're waiting for the draft of this plan, the rule, to come out for public consultation. It will almost certainly be a 60-day consultation period. And then they'll review submissions and they'll make a decision and set the rule in place with the force of law. So, and as recently as this week, on Monday, the U.S. government executive had a cabinet a meeting, and Trump specifically, "I'd like you to speed that up, Alex, if you could." Trump said, "Really speed it up." All right, so this is coming, and it's coming as quickly as Donald Trump's administration can make it happen. Right? The America is concerned about this, have an issue with prices, but they have a second problem, and that is actually counterfeit drugs. And so this has been a problem for some time. This is counterfeit copies of legitimate drugs. And Congress and the administration many years ago set up a track and trace program. It's taking 10 years to roll out. They're in year 6 of the rollout. And basically it's putting a barcode on every product at the manufacturer, and it has to be scanned and tracked, and e-documents of change of ownership have to be in system from the manufacturer's factory gate to the dispensing to the patient at the pharmacy. And They're hugely committed to this, and it has been cited by experts as if they bring in bulk imports from Canada or elsewhere, they're actually creating new holes in opportunities for bad people to insert counterfeits of legitimate drugs. And here's an example. I mean, the former Secretary of Health was, or former head of the FDA was Scott Gottlieb, and there's just a sample of seized fake and controlled drug packages at one airport, JFK. And the problem is that barcoding, track and trace, e-documents of change of ownership doesn't exist in Canada, doesn't exist in many countries that produce drugs. And the minute it crosses into a country that doesn't have track and trace, the whole point of track and trace is destroyed. We don't have that here in Canada. Ironically, we do have it for foods. We have track and trace. Almost every developed country has a track and trace system for foods, where Europe and America are in the process of building it out for prescription drugs. So, okay, why this should be a concern for us? Actually, more than a concern, virtually a crisis. It's simply that the numbers don't. There are three reasons for that. There are too few of us in Canada for all the folks in America. We could, in theory, give our American friends all of our prescription medications. And that would be a direct benefit to 1/9 of their population, and of no direct benefit to 8/9 of their population. And in the meantime, we Canadian patients, such as yours truly, would suffer and we would die prematurely. And I don't think that's what we want. The reality is global manufacturers allocate their manufacturing supply based upon the population and expected demand for any particular medicine in any particular market or country. And what is typically allotted for Canada cannot accommodate both our needs and demands from the United States. As indicated before, Mona, most of our prescription drugs that Canadians use are manufactured abroad somewhere, many different countries. And so Canada, on its own, has no power whatsoever over the manufacture or the ability to ramp up the production of drugs for Canadians or for anybody else. And
That's
the consequence
scary,
of that.
Yeah, it's a
I'm
scary.
sorry?
It's a
Yes.
scary situation.
I will have some strong language about this before the end of this talk. It's a threat to every Canadian who needs a medication. I think it's actually a threat that would affect the health and well-being of millions of Canadians. Is actually, for Canada, is a national security issue and needs to be treated as such by all of our federal politicians and all of the aspects of our federal government. And for that matter, our provincial governments. They actually have a supporting role here that they could play. And it's a flimsy, short-term political quick fix, or the impression of one, for American politicians looking for votes this November, and it ain't going to work. I'm one of those Canadian patients. This is personal for me. These are my prescription medications. We won't go into it. And I was going to tell you about a visit, 3 days of lobbying. I, with colleagues, went to Capitol Hill and the U.S. administration. And at the end of each little visit, I would bring my bottles of pills out, and I would say, "These are mine. I need them. You can't have them." I hope they remember that thought. So, what's been going on? Well, even before the earthquake of July the 31st, on the Alliance for Safe Online Pharmacies had put together a coalition, and several patient groups had joined the coalition, and as a group, we had drafted and sent this letter expressing concerns about the growth in legislation that permits importation of Health Canada approved medicines for U.S. patients, et cetera. And then with the earthquake of July the 31st and the media attention and the responses, we got a meeting in about 2.5 weeks later with the Minister of Health. And let me tell you about a couple of things. When we were at the meeting with the Minister of Health, we asked, she had said actually she'd learned a lot about this in the last 2 months, and it was pretty complex in terms of technical issues and legal issues and regulatory issues. And we asked, hey, we agree with you, it's complex. Can you make sure that we get a technical briefing? So that took place on August the 20th. And this was the final page from that technical briefing. It was done by Health Canada. And we asked questions that clarified that this is a whole of government issue. It's not just a Health Canada issue. It's our external affairs. Our State Department is now called Global Affairs Canada. But actually, in my own view, this is a Prime Minister's office issue. And a little bit later, I'll explain exactly why. But the Canadians have ensuring that Canadians have access to the medications they need is a top priority. And that was good to see that was a statement on behalf, not of Health Canada, but on behalf of the Government of Canada. As a result of that, I reached out personally to our Global Affairs Canada department and asked for a briefing, particularly because I had been invited to go to Washington. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. And I said, probably I'm independent, but we have a common interest. Probably our diplomats and patient advocates in Washington, D.C. should know what is on each other's mind and be aware of what each other's key messages were. These are the talking. Who knew that Canada, through Global Affairs Canada, has an advocacy network all across the United States? And it's not just trade commissioners, et cetera. It's broader than that. And these are two key talking points that Global Affairs Canada gave me from their key messages and this is actually stronger than what had been said by the Minister of Health and the Prime Minister of Canada when they were scrummed by the media after the earthquake announcement from Washington. All right, and you can see there. All right, Canada would have no choice but to respond to protect human health in Canada. All right, and we'll talk about some of the policy choices that our government has. The election was called officially at the beginning of September. The coalition group made a judgment call that they didn't want to rock the boat during the election period. So Best Medicines Coalition wrote on September 11th to the Minister of Health, saying basically that the two meetings, including the tech brief, did not alleviate our concerns about the U.S. federal and state proposals. And what are you going to do about it? We all look forward to engaging with the new government of Canada, and we won't have a Minister of Health really. We don't know who it is until the cabinet's sworn in on November 20th. So we've got about 3 weeks to go. Next steps, the White House is committed to seeing this through. We can expect those draft regulations, draft rules in November or December, with the final rules drafted in next year and published at a date that suits the convenience of President Trump and the political needs. And we anticipate that at both the federal and the state level in the United States, the momentum will continue to grow. And the regulators in the United States are now on side. Support is bipartisan. And the indications are that Republicans intend to use this as their claim to have done something about high drug prices in the United States for election purposes.
John, then just a small question right now.
Mm-hmm.
What are the legal rules now in Canada regarding the business practices of the drug wholesalers and distributors?
The short answer is, and I have a slide on it in a moment, is that at the moment, there's absolutely nothing in the Canadian law that would prevent a middle person in Canada from cooperating with a U.S. state, with a U.S. wholesaler, or with a U.S. pharmacy or chain of pharmacies in redirecting the supply. There may be, and there probably are, some private business contracts between the different parties in the distribution chain, and there may be some limitations, but I've never seen one of those contracts. And from the public interest of Canadian patients should not depend upon what may or may not be existing in private contracts that we don't have access to. So a little bit more about that in a moment. Let me tell you, a nonprofit group in the United States called the Partnership for Safe Medicines, which has been very concerned about the issue of counterfeit medicines in the United States, including counterfeits coming through the internet from people not of goodwill who claim to be Canadian pharmacy sites and bringing in adulterated or outright counterfeit medicines, pretending to be valid medicines from Canada. So they heard about the earthquake, and they heard about our responses to it, and they invited the Best Medicines Coalition and Canadian pharmacists to join them in 3 days of active lobbying. We were broken up into 3 teams, and in 3 days, those 3 teams saw senior political representatives of 45 senators of the 100 U.S. senators. And my team was focused on senior Republican senators. We also had a meeting with a senior political representative of the Department of Health and Human Services. And I had, Global Affairs Canada head office had reached out to the embassy. I had met with the embassy before a meeting with any of the U.S. politicians or bureaucrats. And when we came out of that meeting at Health and Human Services on that day, there were 2 senior officials from the embassy waiting in the lobby to debrief us on exactly what was said. And the day later, the White House reaffirmed the commitment and they were thinking about doing this by way of an executive order, which is another legal mechanism in the United States, that's at the president's sole discretion and isn't part of the rulemaking process. So stay tuned as the heat on this issue escalates. I'm glad that the Global Affairs Canada are taking this very seriously, and I'm tracking it very seriously, but they really needed to know what was said. And basically, we got the word that we're doing this reg. And once it's put out for public comment, you're welcome to put in your comments. We're doing this reg. So the Americans are going to create a problem for us sooner or later. And what are we going to do about it in Canada? Well, the proof that there's a gap in Canadian laws to deal with this is this bill, which was introduced back in 2005 by the Liberal health minister at the time. And there was an election called the next month. And this bill has never been finished. It's lined the idea of legislating around this to allow the Minister of Health to demand information from anyone in the distribution chain and to control, limit, or ban exports to the United States of medicines in Canada intended for Canadians, has been sitting on the shelf for the last 14 years through governments of different political stripes. We also could, and wouldn't it? So let me just give you an example. Somebody on behalf of the state of Florida comes up here and is talking to somebody in the distribution chain and says, "Oh, I see you have a skid of medicines there. How much are you going to get for that when you sell it in the next step in the process?" And I'll just pick a number out of the air. Okay, it's a big skid. It's going to be $5 million. Okay. And the agent of Florida says, "I got a check here for you for $7 million. How long do you think it's going to, it could take a less than totally up and up person in the distribution chain to say, where do you want this skid delivered?" And right now, today, the only thing the driver of the truck with that skid of medicines for Canadians would worry about is not anybody at the Canadian border, but the border officer on the U.S. side. And if they put this by executive order or by a new rule, they put in place an approval from Secretary Azar, then that's the free pass into the United States for that skid of medicines intended for Canadians. We could bolster enforcement at the border, but we actually don't have the right legal levers for our border officers to do this. There could be greater restrictions on those internet pharmacies, the ones that aren't so scrupulous. There are some good ones, and there are many, many bad ones, and there are many, many pretending to be Canadian online pharmacies where they're actually nowhere near Canada. But the pretend goes on, and maybe some of those drugs are good, but there's a huge risk that they're adulterated or outright counterfeits. The regulators of our pharmacists and pharmacies could put in additional restrictions. I don't want to bore you with the details, but there are actually some identified loopholes in the current regulations by the pharmacy colleges. But and those are at the provincial level. That's what I alluded to earlier. And but the big one is we could declare this a national security issue. And then there are some legal tools available to our federal government. But our problem is our bureaucrats naturally are inclined to be cautious and to urge on the political masters going slow. For example, when I reached out to Global Affairs Canada and asked for a briefing, we had a meeting on Friday morning, and the information advice that I got is, well, this could be a problem, but it's not going. The process takes quite a while in the United States, so 2 or 3 years out. And that afternoon, the state of Florida issued its 40-page concept plan, and it's more than a concept, 40 pages. And the very last page of that 40-page plan includes a list of Canadian distributors that they'd like to do business with, name, rank, and serial number. So I sent it, a PDF of this plan, to those two officials from Global Affairs Canada with the comment, well, so much for 2 or 3 years, guys. And this is going through the U.S. Rulemaking process at breakneck speed for rulemaking processes. Our government of Canada has to be concerned about other open and potentially contentious issues between Canada and the United States. We have the NAFTA 2.0 trade agreement between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, and it hasn't been ratified all the way around. President Trump has found the drawer in the toolbox for tariffs and tariff wars, and we've had some of our industrial sectors have had tariffs slapped on them. I think the wish of some people in the government of Canada is that we'll rag the puck, not do anything to poke a stick into the U.S. executive until at least after the November 2020 election. But I'm not sure we're going to have the luxury of that much time. And if we decide we have to do something overtly, and the interest groups, both from the industry side and the patient side, would you guys please step up and say no in public and say clearly how you're going to make no stick? And they haven't done that to our satisfaction yet. And when they feel the need to do that, it will be an embarrassment for President Trump and Secretary Azar and Governor DeSantis and a whole bunch of other people. And is it better to embarrass them right now, or shall we wait until very close to the November election? I'm not sure it's politically smart to wait very much longer. If we have to say no to them and make it stick and do it in public, then probably the sooner we say no as the government of Canada with legal teeth, the better, and the less harm will come. That would be my what to expect. It did not emerge, this issue, in our recent concluded federal election, but the momentum is growing. And the health organizations that were involved are convening, and we're drafting a follow-up letter to the Prime Minister and hopefully to the clerk of the Privy Council, and try to get this. Say they really got to bear down on this now that our election is out of the way. And so what can you do? I think it's not time to panic. It is time to be informed and to stay informed. You can follow Best Medicine Coalition on Twitter. There's other things you can do. You can, for yourself as a person, for yourself as an organization, you can develop, understand, and elaborate your own position on this issue, and you can think of ways to raise your voice, finding opportunities to engage with both federal and provincial governments to let them know that we're concerned and we want clear action. So what the specific thing is, we need our federal government to quickly and definitively clarify exactly how it's going to protect the Canadian drug supply and take whatever actions are necessary to make that stick. That's my contact information if you want to follow up. And again, I want to say thank you to the Canadian Cancer Survivors Network for making this possible. And thank you for listening. And now it's time for any questions or answers.
Yes, and thank you, John. Yes, thank you, John. We'll now have our question and answer session. A reminder to the attendees, you can still ask a question very quickly if you type into the box on the bottom of the screen on your right-hand side of your screen. We have the first question from Kim Steele. Will the slide deck be shared? Yes, Kim, everyone who's registered for today's webinar will be sent the link to SlideShare and all the other information that was given today. Michelle Long asks a question. John, this is going to you. Could the USA sue Canada under the free trade agreement for not accepting to sell drugs to the USA?
Michelle and others, of course, anyone can sue anybody over anything, but how real and how far would they get? In the old free trade agreement, there is an exemption, which is quite strong and quite wide for anything that the host country declares to be a matter of national security. And it's an override. And there is a separate tribunal, a dispute resolution thing under that old trade agreement. And since the new trade agreement actually hasn't been ratified, anything that would happen would be under the old trade agreement. They could start an action, but Canada would have no alternative but to claim a national security exemption if it's affecting the health and well-being and lives, preventing deaths of hundreds of thousands or millions of Canadians. That's a national security issue for those individual Canadians and the group as a whole. So I think Canada would be on solid legal grounds to claim that national security exemption if there's an objection or a legal process against us.
John, we have a comment and another question. Deidre Floyd said, if we were to promote passing Bill C-83, it would likely take approximately 3 years. Deidre is the president of the Canadian Epilepsy Alliance. Then we have another question from Michelle Long. Are the Canadian politicians waiting till it is a deal done in order not to expose Canada to retaliation in case this never gets up the ground should it be defeated in the U.S. courts?
It is possible. I for one, don't have a way of reading the minds of Canadian politicians. I can only rely upon their spoken word. Yes, that would be consistent with the advice to go slow and be careful and keep our heads down and not poke the bear in the United States. But with respect, there's a phrase in our national anthem called "We Stand on Guard for Thee." And it's time for our government to find its spine and stand up and guard the interests of Canadian patients. Yes, it could take 3 years in the parliamentary process to pass that legislation, but that's if it's low priority. this is not low priority. The government in the House of Commons and the Senate have the ability to move legislation through much more quickly than that. For example, there's a budget bill done every year, and that involves trillions of dollars. So it can be done if there is political will, and it all comes back to the political will. And the reaction of the opposition politicians, who now have more influence than they had before the election, given the minority government situation, was very, it built confidence, in my mind at least, that there are politicians who want to stand on guard for us.
Yes, thank you, John. I have 3 more questions waiting. I think we can manage them. The first one is a bit long. It's from Nigel Rawson to John. He says, I do not know what organizations are on the list of people in Canada that the U.S. wants to do business with, but I assume it's mainly wholesale pharmacy. Any wholesale pharmacy that sells to the U.S. in large quantities will be blacklisted by pharma, as was done with internet pharmacies 10 years ago. Is the whole idea really feasible, or is it pure political blustering in the U.S.?
Nigel and others will only know if this is only a political spin or is actually meant to be real until we're in the thick of it and find out. The list I can send to anyone who wants it. I can send the Florida plan with the list of their people they're interested in doing business with, and it's much more than wholesale pharmacies. There are several layers in the distribution chain between the wholesale pharmacy and the manufacturer, and any of those points could be a point of access to someone with a big checkbook.
Yes, those are interesting questions and interesting thoughts.
Yeah,
yes. Go ahead, John.
I can't predict what we'll know 6 months from now that we don't know to a certainty today, but I think that when pretty soon the majority of the U.S. population, their state governments will have passed laws to enable this. In some cases, to enable private players, private actors, wholesalers in pharmacies, in pharmacy chains, and in some cases, the state being the actual actor for at least the drug programs that the state is responsible for. The Florida one is particular, among other things, is targeting medications for HIV and AIDS. One might think that has something to do with the prison population that the state of Florida is responsible for. And others.
That's also interesting because of the huge populations. I mean, Florida itself is 25 million people, so it's sort of scary too.
And Mona, given the demographics of Florida versus Canada as a whole, even we're 36 million people, Florida's 25 or so, but given the aging demographics of Florida compared to all of Canada, there are as many people taking prescription medications in Florida as there are in Canada. So they,
yes.
And if 20, I mean, to be dramatic, and we're not there yet, but if 20% of the U.S. market were to, as much as 20% were to ask for supply, divert supply from Canadians, our pharmacy shelves could be empty in 6 months.
Yes, I've heard that we probably have a stock of 65 days worth of medications. Juliet Zhang is asking, how are patients being made aware of this risk? Before today, I had no idea this was going on. Well, we are doing our bit at the Canadian Cancer Survivor Network by having this webinar, and certainly we're going to be asking John back to follow up on this as the situation unravels. John, what other ideas do you have, or what else do you know is going on to make patients aware of this risk?
Okay, well, we're looking for news opportunities. We're looking for other opportunities like this webinar. When the earthquake took place back on July 31, we were in the media quite vociferously. Not everybody reads every media account. I get that. And the next shoe to drop, I think, major shoe to drop will be either the executive order from the president or the launching of the draft regulation for public comment. That will say, hey, we're really, really serious. But I don't get confused, because they're doing two things at once. There are two tracks. The Health Department in the U.S. is drafting a rule for bulk imports from other countries, and they're also drafting a rule specific for bulk imports from Canada. So we got to, we're less, from the Canadian perspective, we're less concerned about the one affecting other countries, and we're really concerned about the one that, and its potential impact on the health and well-being of Canadian patients. So, and if you have any, hey, my email I'm accessible by email. And if you have any other ideas for how we can get the word out, please do share those ideas, and we'll be happy to do everything in our power. I can only speak for Best Medicines Coalition. I've spent a few months walking around the halls of power in Ottawa, bureaucratic and political, on issues like price controls, on the National Pharmacare proposal, on some, and the design of the new Canadian Drug Agency. I think I'm going to have to go back again and knock on those same doors and take it to lots of political players in Ottawa and some additional bureaucratic players. Hopefully our group can get an audience with, the whole group can get an audience with the Prime Minister's office.
Well, John, we certainly all appreciate your leadership in this. I have one last question. I think it's the last one, and I'm not sure about what it means, but Warren Kimmick is asking, the legal and non-legal drug cartels can make the changes that you want, but they are the ones who must be regulated. It is no surprise that they are manufacturing their drugs in foreign countries outside of Canadian laws. Well, as far as I understand, in general, and this is like business, manufacturing goes where it's cheaper to be done. And John, what's your comment on that?
Well, my comment is, as to the best of my knowledge, Health Canada, as our regulator for safety and effectiveness and quality, is doing a good job. So medicines that are being manufactured abroad and being imported into Canada for Canadians to use are being checked. I'm not aware of any serious quality or safety problem, or when there are recalls, things go wrong. But I believe we have a reasonably effective system of checks and balances, and there is cooperation, by the way, between the U.S. FDA and the Health Canada as regulator in terms of inspections, both announced and unannounced surprise inspections of those plants overseas. Yes, there are questions about what regulations are most appropriate, but at the moment, I'm not saying we have an out of control or poorly controlled safety situation with those drugs manufactured abroad. If providing they're legitimate drugs, and providing some bad guys aren't sneaking into the supply chain abroad and adulterating those drugs, or actually substituting outright counterfeits for them.
Yeah, that's always a worry. John, I have one more question. We'll try and fit that in. We've got a couple of minutes. Deidre Floyd is asking again, I guess this is relating to what patients could do, but also she said, should each national agency write the Prime Minister and copy Global Affairs?
Yes, and copy Health Canada, and copy the umbrella patient groups. And Diabetes Canada has been very proactive on this one. The Health Charities Coalition of Canada, CORD, the Canadian Organization for Rare Disorders, and Best Medicines in terms of the patient voice. Let us know what you're doing. Yes, one of the, I don't think it's quite right just yet, but I anticipate we're going to need a call to action to say, also write your newly elected, re-elected member of parliament. Keep them in the say. Let them know that we're concerned and we don't like the momentum of what's going on in the United States. And what is our federal government going to do about it?
Okay, thank you everyone for your questions, and that brings us to the end of today's sessions. But if anyone has further questions, please send them to communications@survivornet.ca and we'll pass them along to John Adams. Thank you for attending today's webinar. We'd also like to take this opportunity again to thank you, John, for presenting. Your expertise and your sort of whole soaked in this whole area, which is, I guess, to many of us still new and very confusing. Reminder that this webinar will be available in full at the CCSN YouTube or SlideShare accounts tomorrow. Registrants will receive an email link to the saved webinar. Please feel free to review it at your leisure and share it with friends, family, and colleagues. Our next webinar, Cancer-Related Fatigue, Energizing and Empowering Yourself on the Cancer Journey, is scheduled for Thursday, October 31st at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. To register for that session or any future webinars, visit our website at www.survivornet.ca. And that concludes today's session. Thank you for attending and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.